It is my pleasure to call on the stage our Ask the Doctor panel, and this year that panel will be moderated. That's okay. Okay, so well then we'll call the moderators up. Is that okay, Lisa? You're the boss.
That's how we're going to do it.
All right. So our moderators for this year's Ask the Doctor panel are Lisa Wise, who you all know is our vice chair for information and support.
Aww.
Come on up, Lisa, and Peter DeNardis, the chair of the IWMF board. So I'm going to turn this over to them.
Your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? All those nights when you've got no lights.
Hello, Planet Waldenstrom. Are you ready for some Walden fun before we skedaddle out of here? Pete DeNardis, IWMF Chair Extraordinary. Are you ready to rock and roll, buddy?
I'm ready to have the doctors do the rocking and rolling.
I love it. I'm with you, Pete. Let's do this.
Hey.
Hi, everybody. I am Lisa Wise, Vice Chair of Information and Support at the IWMF. And it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 2024 Ask the Doctor panel. Woo! Guys, can you believe it? We're at the end of our 2024 Ed Forum, and the truth is, I do not want to let any of you go because this has been fun. So, I know that no one here ever asked for peripheral neuropathy. Am I right, Kathy C. in the last row? Yes. I know that no one ever asked for anemia. Am I right, Steve in Texas who is watching? Yes. And nobody ever asked for sky-high IgM, right, Suzanne in Sweden? I know you're on there. But here we are, together, in our WM community that feels like family. Can you feel the buzz in the air here? Have you felt it all weekend long? Me too. Can you feel some tingling in your toes? You might want to get a second opinion. Peripheral neuropathy could be happening. We can help. We can help with that. But there's one thing that we did ask for, and that is an awesome Ask the Doctor panel. And by golly, that is what you're going to get before we pack you up and wrap you up and send you home out of Renton, Washington, okay? So get ready for this. Whether you are here in the ballroom or whether you are across the world in your living room, I hope that you have had the best weekend of learning, of connecting, and most importantly, of feeling less alone. And you are in the company of people who really get it. Just like that old television program, Cheers, that you heard the theme song from, where everybody knows your name. Here on Planet Waldenstrom with the IWMF, everybody knows your IgM. And they love you for it. They truly do. So let's send some collective love to everybody who is joining virtually. For any of you who, like me, was stuck at home in past years and had to be in the safety of my living room and live in that bubble, we know what that FOMO is like when you can't be in this room, but you are over there watching, listening, hearing, and connecting. So let's send them a little bit of love, okay? Oh my God! I love that you did that. I was just going to say on the count of 3, let's blow them a kiss or give them an air hug or give them a little Swiftie heart with our hand that the little kids can do, but I can't. So 1, 2, 3, guys. Mwah, we love you. Yes, hearts everywhere, hearts. They saw, they felt it. I know they did. So I hope that they felt that global WM love, and so did you right here in this room. I want to give heartfelt thanks to everybody who submitted a question in advance. I want you to know that we received a record-breaking almost 200 questions for this. Thank you for groaning. We are so grateful for your thoughtfulness. That was the appropriate response. Please accept our sincerest apologies. I mean that with my whole heart for not being able to get to everyone one of your 200 questions. We wish we could be here until midnight, but we will do our best to move very quickly. And do you all know the marvelous Meg Mangan? You knew of all am I right? She's right here in the front row, second row. Will you please stand up? Please kindly stand up so we can applaud Meg Mangan. Not only is she the queen of WM Facebook, she's also the panel's queen of questions. She has been the collector and the curator of these 200 questions. We are so grateful for your wisdom and your insight always. And I want to thank you, Meg, for offering your invaluable presence and your brilliance online to the sport community and to all of us here. We're so grateful to you, Meg. Now, everything you've been waiting for, please join me in thanking our rock star WM docs who have been with us this weekend and who have given so generously of their time, of their expertise, of their shared wisdom, their deep passion for what they do, and above all else, their caring hearts. And for all of you who've been in a room with them receiving that care, you know of what I speak. They are our heroes, truly, and we're not only grateful to them, but we are grateful to all of their families back home who they have left in order to be in this room with us, because their families share them very graciously, and that is an enormous sacrifice that I never take for granted. So if you are able, will you join me in a standing ovation to welcome our rock stars as they come on stage one last time for the 2024 Ed Forum. Dr. Judith Trotman from the University of Sydney, Australia. Welcome. Dr. Sheeba Thomas from MD Anderson Cancer Center. You like to get away. Dr. Jeff Matous from the Colorado Blood Cancer Institute. And Dr. Jorge Castillo from Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Thank you, doctors. Anywhere you're comfortable. We have so many, please stay on your feet for a minute. We have so many, sorry gang, that was so cruel. That was the meanest thing I've ever done in my whole life. I'm not a mean person, I promise. We have so many rock stars in the house, and this is our panel for this morning, but our cup spilleth over. We would like all of our rock star docs who have been with us for the weekend to please come. We have reserved seating in the front row so that they can join in this Ask the Doctor panel with their words of wisdom. Dr. Shirley Dessa from the University College London. Welcome, Dr. Dessa, and thank you. Dr. Zach Hunter from Dana-Farber, maybe in the house. Dr. Maria Luisa Guerrera, our new young investigator in the future of WM. Are there any other rock star docs in the house? Dr. Mary Kwok is here. Dr. Mary Kwok is here. We had a Dr. Kwok sighting. For reals? Where's? Oh, thank you, Dr. Matous. Really, truly? Oh, Dr. Kwok, yay, you were hiding on me, holding out on me. Who else we got, folks? Don't be shy. Thank you, Dr. Dessa, thank you. Okay, let's start, folks. Please have a seat. Did you feel the love? For real? Is anybody getting a little verklempt? Dr. Castillo, I think you're a little, what did you say, long and unnecessary?
I moved.
Long and unnecessary, I love that. Okay. Let's start with 2 soft pitch questions, okay? And then what I'm going to do is Pete and I are going to be going back and forth with this. We're going to hop off stage, let the doctors, because, we can tell I'm an attention hogger, so I need to be working on that. So I'm going to sit back down there and be quiet, because I do know how to do that, too. 2 soft pitches. First question, if you were not a physician, what other career would you enjoy most? Now, since Dr. Matous loves any kind of pitch, we'll have him go first. Did you see it coming, a baseball reference?
Caught that, Lisa.
Is he mic'd up?
Test. There we go. Oh. Okay, so I think I'd taught high school and coached basketball.
Wow. That's super cool. I wasn't expecting that. Really? I thought it would be cycling.
Well, I'm not good enough. to make money doing that. Yeah, you have to be a genetic freak to do that. So.
But people still remember the webinar where you showed your bicycle hanging in the office. Am I right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, but I think I would have been a teacher.
Love that. I think you are a teacher, Dr. Matous, one of the greatest on the planet. Yeah. I think they agree. Dr. Trotman?
I have never ever thought about doing anything else.
Wow.
But my mother, who was my physics teacher and told me I was very useless at physics, had decided that if I didn't get into med school, I was going to do chemical engineering. And you do what my mother tells, so thank God I got into med school.
Dr. Trotman, we are thanking God for that as well. Truly, truly. Dr. Castillo?
I thought about being a teacher. My mom is a teacher, right? So, but they're so underpaid. So I said, doctor sounds like a good idea. I would really, if I wouldn't be a doctor, I think I would be a chef. I would like to cook for people. I cook often at home. One of my love languages.
Yes.
Feed my kids, and I think they feel it. So that would be something I would like to do.
I love that. What's your favorite Peruvian dish to cook?
Well, there are several, but I think probably the ceviche, going back to the basics. I think that's probably where I shine. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Let's put that on the menu for the next year's Ed Forum, y'all. Dr. Thomas.
So ironically, like Dr. Trotman, if I wasn't going to medicine, I was actually going to be a chemical engineer.
Wow. We should get our mothers together.
Right?
You would have been on a completely different panel together today. Well, we are so grateful that you have chosen this career, and we're so grateful that you are here. Now, in the movie, this is my second soft pitch question, and then I'll be sitting down and Pete will be taking over. In the movie Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart says, I can't do a Humphrey Bogart imitation, but I'm sure you could. Of all the gin joints in all the towns in the world, she walks into mine. Why did you choose to walk into the WM gin joint? And what drove you to pursue a career in Waldenstrom, macroglobulinemia specifically?
It was my patient. It was Andrew Warden who, I had this wonderful relationship with him. He introduced me to WM Aussies, to the IWMF. He said this cartwheel project is a fantastic platform for us to build this whimsical registry. And I thought it was going to be a small Part 2 project for Ibrahim, and it's become so much bigger than that. And just gradually through those patient relationships and patients coming to me, and seeing the vast diversity, I think when you are a hematologist who only sees 1 or 2 patients with WM, it's about the hemoglobin and the IgM and the fatigue. But the more you see, the more fascinating manifestations you see. And just these really beautiful patients who, because you have enough time to learn about your disease, and can I just say super quick,
Don't be
the
quick.
fact that it's called Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia is a brilliant stroke of luck. Don't ever call it lymphoplasmacytic lymphoma like we do in the textbooks, because as soon as you're diagnosed with it, there's no way you can remember it. So your doctor has to write it down for you. And so you go to the internet, and then you find the IWMF, and you become versed in it. And then WM is a nice, easy.
I love that. Dr. Thomas.
So I was lucky when I was doing fellowship to meet Donna Weber, who some of you may know. She's been treating Waldenstroms for a long time, and she has a passion for the disease, and she inspired that passion in me. So
Beautiful.
got that from her.
Beautiful. Dr. Matous, thank you.
It was a quasi-random trip on a bus ride where I met a guy called Steve Treon.
Wow.
We were going to a meeting in Whistler, BC, and it was up from Vancouver, and I was talking to this guy in front of me about what he did and what I do and that kind of stuff, and he goes, "You ought to consider joining something called the Waldenstrom's Clinical Trials Group," and that was many, many years ago. So Steve wrote me in.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Dr. Desai?
Ooh, you took me by surprise there.
I love doing
I
that.
was just nodding off.
They're a little boring already?
So I came from a background of treating myeloma, and I found the WM patients were kind of just hovering around amongst all these myeloma patients. So I decided to put them into a clinic, and that was 20 years ago, and we now have a huge kind of crowd. And it's just fascinating, and I love, like Judith was saying, you get to know people over a very long time. I really value that as well.
Mm. What would you be doing if you weren't doing medicine?
Medicine. At the time, I don't know, but now I'd love to become a historian.
Oh, wow. That got an ooh. Dr. Kwok, would you share with us before we come back to Dr. Castillo?
Sure. I also was mentored into WM through Dr. Ed Libby, who retired from the Fred Hutch. And he mentored me for a year before he retired, and then I got to be introduced to this wonderful group of patients. And I tried to pin down Jorge one year at ASH, and thankfully he had coffee with me and taught me a lot, and just really, really happy to be a part of this community.
Wonderful. And what would you be if you weren't in
I also would have been a teacher. I was almost a teacher, and then I got accepted to medical school.
For real. Wow. Dr. Castillo, wrapping up this question?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of that, I didn't fall into, I think Waldenstrom fall into me up to some degree. It's a little bit different. I was finishing a master's in clinical research, and I wanted to create a clinical, or at least lead a clinical trial program. And in the place where I was, things were not really flowing very smoothly. So I was starting to look into different places to basically do what I wanted to do, which is become a clinical trialist. So it's about midnight. My daughter was just born. She was 2 years old. So my wife was sleeping. It was midnight. I was just reading one of these journals, JCO, right? The Journal of Clinical Oncology. I was just reading it, the actual physical journal, right? We don't do that anymore, right? But yeah, I was doing that. And then I see these announcements. It was like, the Dana-Farber and the Bing Center for Waldenstrom's are looking for a clinician to join and lead the clinical trial program. It's like, I mean, I like lymphomas, right? Yeah, okay. This is Waldenstrom. That's a lymphoma too, all right? Yeah, okay. So my experience with Waldenstrom before that was maybe one patient per year, even though I was a lymphoma specialist in the institution where I was working at. So I think, you know what? Here goes nothing. I sent an email to Stephen Treon, who I already interacted previously with some other patients. I forwarded some patients to him, and I emailed him, and with my CV. And within 3 minutes, he calls me. So I sent the email at 12:05, and he answered me like at 12:08, right? He called me. He's like, hey, I just looked at your CV. Everything looks great. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm really interested. So we started talking, and he basically invited me to come up for an interview. And I was told, I don't know, I was told it was a very competitive position. So I was actually very happy that I ended up where I am. So that was 10 years ago.
Wow. We're all so happy that you are where you are. Thank you to all of our Rockstar Docs. I'm going to disappear down below. Pete's going to take over to ask the first set of questions.
Okay, so here we go. So the plan is we may direct the question to one in particular, and then the rest of you can chime in, or I'll just ask the question, and then whoever wants to answer can answer. But I do want to mention that we may phone a friend with Dr. Kwok and Dr. Desai here, so just so you know.
Especially.
Yeah. So
can we use 50-50?
yeah, there we go. Maybe if we need it. Maybe you can ask them. So the first set of questions have to do with everybody's favorite flavor of treatment at this point, which is the BTK inhibitors. So the first question, and I'll ask Dr. Trotman only because she's sitting closest to me, so it's easier that way. Are BTK inhibitors a better option for young patients?
Not immediately. For me, for young patients, and there's this constant sort of angst over giving bendamustine to someone who's young. But I think if you give them bendamustine, they will have a very good, long, prolonged response. And sorry, when I say bendamustine rituximab, that's BR, okay? They will have a long, prolonged response. They will have suppression of their immune system, what we call their cellular immunity. Their T cells will be low for a couple of years, but then all that will recover to a large extent, and they will get a very prolonged remission, generally speaking. So I prefer to keep the BTK inhibitor up my sleeve, in my pocket for later. And use the immunochemotherapy, as I said yesterday, use it when you're younger, because you're more able to cope with it.
Okay, thank you.
Others?
Others, yeah.
I'll sound just like Dr. Trotman here. And so I think that we have really good evidence that the BTK inhibitors work just about as well when you use them second as when you use them first. And so I have frank discussions with my patients. I say, there's chemoimmunotherapy where you're done in a short period of time, or if you want to take a pill for a long period of time, that's great too. And they're both really super effective treatment options. And so very often patients will make the decision after we have the conversation with them.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about initiation of therapy in somebody who's young, and again, the definition of young changes, right, a lot depending on who's who and how old you are as a physician. But for example, for me, young is somebody who's younger than 60. I think that's young. But we do have patients in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, really, really young people. I also, prefer not to use long-term treatment in somebody who's young, really young. But also have some concerns about exposing somebody who's young to chemotherapy, for example. Right, so I need to have, as you said, a very open discussion about the pros and cons of each approach. I find myself sometimes discussing also proteasome inhibitors in patients who are young. So in that way, you give them a finite duration of therapy, that is not a chemotherapy, doesn't contain a chemotherapy, per se. So that's essentially the way I look at it. So it's not my preferred way to go. On that same note, there are a few patients, young patients, who feel that that's the best option for them, right? And again, that's, I think, the best way that we address things for patients is not to tell them what is best or not, better or not better. It's just to discuss with them all the different issues and the problems with the medications, and then have a decision, kind of a joint decision-making process.
Yeah, I think you can hear that there are no absolutes in this. It's always a matter of taking into account what other medical problems people have, what other medications they're on, what the financial toxicity is like, what transportation, whether they're able to come regularly for a fixed duration therapy type of cycle. All of these things get taken into account, in addition to taking into account the risk, the side effects with long-term treatment, as well as like bendamustine or proteasome inhibitors like the Velcade type drugs.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we almost have sort of a consensus here, so that's great. So on a related note, and it's not a BTK question, but it's related to the young patients, I've heard a couple presenters over the years say something like, I might consider a stem cell transplant in a young patient. So in what kind of situation would that occur?
I think we would consider like stem cell collection.
No, but I mean
which is not precisely going for a transplant, right? I mean, I think the role of transplants, I mean, at least my perspective, and we're talking about autologous transplants, right? Your own stem cells, not somebody else's stem cells. That's an allogeneic transplant. That is a different ballgame. I mean, there has been specific indications, and I think you need to talk to your doctor to understand the indications for a transplant. But just the fact that somebody is young doesn't make me immediately think, oh, we need to do a transplant on this patient earlier. And I don't think that's precisely the case. I think we could discuss stem cell collection and maybe keep these stem cells on the side for a future transplant if needed, right, which is a different perspective.
Okay. Do you all kind of agree with that, or anyone have a different opinion on that?
No, I agree, and I also, and I'm talking the very young here, putting those stem cells aside is useful in the case you need them for autologous stem cell transplant, but also in case you need them to rescue someone from the cytopenia, the very low blood counts that some patients can get after CAR T cell therapy. You know, you really, really need to do a lot of crystal ball gazing when you've got a patient in their 30s and 40s with WM. And I think it's really important that patients who are in their 60s and 70s don't necessarily take home messages that we really have targeted for that very, very young patient population, where we're not just aiming for 10, 20, 30 years, but longer.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, and I'll address it to Dr. Thomas, since you're on the other end. Here we go. So please, can you discuss the pros and cons of sequencing BTK inhibitors before venetoclax or after?
So sequencing is a good question, and not one that we have easy answers to. There is some data, at least from CLL, that if you, in the lab, if you give a BTK inhibitor prior to a BCL2 inhibitor, venetoclax type drug, that giving the BTK inhibitor can kind of make this cell kind of upregulate, kind of enhance the its dependence on BCL2, so that if you then, you make the cell more dependent on BCL2 and then you come in with a BCL2 inhibitor after, it may be more effective in that order.
So, I mean, at least my experience with BTK and BCL2, and again, some clinical experience with CLL, which is not a lot, it seems, at least based on the little evidence out there, that if you do a BTK inhibitor first and then a BCL2 inhibitor later, that affects a little bit the efficacy of the BCL2 inhibitor, makes it a bit less effective. And I've seen that published in CLL, but again, small studies, retrospective, so it's very difficult to say anything about it. In Waldenstrom's, I think that the efficacy of BTK inhibitors in most patients tend to be maybe a little bit on the higher side compared to BCL2 inhibitors per se. So we tend to use BTK inhibitors first and BCL2 inhibitors later. But I don't think we don't have no experience of using BCL2 inhibitors first and BTK inhibitors later. So I think it's very difficult to really provide any specific guidance. I think the fact that the BTK inhibitors are approved and NCC endorsed and all that and readily available, I think that it makes it easier to use them first and BCL2 inhibitors later.
Can I add? But I also think it's appropriate they get used first. Wholly appropriate. We have this huge body of evidence of thousands and thousands of patients over several years use with BTK inhibitors, where we've got a small amount of published data from the first-in-class BCL2 inhibitor in Waldenstrom's. So, I think, to me, it's not, it's not a question because I couldn't get it in Australia. But to me, if I had the option, it's clear, it's no question. And I think we need to be, really clear on that the data is very promising and very, very good, but it's a small body of early data.
I think WMNet is going to help us learn how to use these medicines better in the future.
Right, we're excited about that. We're really looking forward to the progress that's going to happen with the WMNet.
And learning whether they should be used sequentially or together. Because we can't, I think using them together, the real advantage won't it to try and see if we can do a fixed duration of combination.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, the last question regarding on the BTK line of questioning. According to clinical trial data, a 120-pound patient should obtain sufficient blood saturation from 140 milligrams of ibrutinib, let's say. So if blood saturation levels of drugs are related to body weight, should that be measured and factored in when prescribing BTK inhibitor dosage?
Dr. Matous is smiling. I feel like he knows the patient who asked this question.
It's a classic patient question, which is, do I need this whole dose? I'm little, right? You never hear the guy who's enormous say, hey, do I need more? And we're in a data-free zone there. We really are. And so we have some preclinical data that suggests how much of a BTK inhibitor you need to in a test tube, achieve its maximal effect. But in patients, it's more difficult to ascertain. So I think all of us, I'm kind of a rule follower, and so if the studies were done with a certain dose, I start with that dose. Then based on work that Jorge and Shana have done and published now, I know that if my patient is struggling with a certain dose, I have a lot less anxiety than I used to have about decreasing the dose and helping that side effect while maintaining effectiveness. And so patients ask me that, and I very politely brush them aside and give them the full dose and see how it goes.
But as you say, you have a good, thanks to Jorge and Shana's data, have a much lower threshold for dose reductions for intolerance. Jorge, did you look at that by weight? Because I remember women had, I think, 40% dose reduction compared to 20% men.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We didn't look at that specifically, but we are actually going to look at that because the same analysis that we did for ibrutinib, we're actually trying to do the same analysis for zanubrutinib because we are actually decreasing the dose in patients with zanubrutinib as well from 320 to 40, 160, what patients on 80 milligrams. So, and understand really, what the patterns are without looking at the data formally, I think is going to show pretty much the same thing. Right, that we can decrease the dose in some specific patients, and I think it might be because of BMI, but we are going to be looking into that, and we have not looked into that precisely. But the fact that it's mostly women and individuals, over 65 that tend to require the dose reductions because of side effects, I think has to do either something about renal function or something about body mass index or something around those lines, but we'll look into that.
And it's a real reminder that the companies need to start looking at better the pharmacodynamic data, not just the PK data and the blockage of mid-88 blockage of the BTK enzyme, but actually what it's doing in the body in people of different.
I agree with that. It's just, just thinking it's very challenging, right, to do a study of that nature, right? It's just so difficult. You need so many patients, right, to actually prove that, 280 is better than 420 or the same. It's just, how do you design a study like that? It's almost...
I know, it's very difficult, but then you've got thousands of patients around the world who are probably taking too high a dose and struggling with the drug.
Yeah.
And probably
maybe a post-marketing study they should do.
Right. So I was going to say that could be part of the WMNet. You have that patient database, and you can mine that data and see if there's any patterns. And sort of a related question is, in the early days of doing regular chemotherapy treatments, they did calculate that based on your body mass index, how much you should get treated with. How did that come about, and why isn't it happening with BTK inhibitors?
I give the example of antibiotics, right? So in adults, you have a fixed dose of antibiotics. You don't do a weight-based dose of antibiotics because you're trying to reach a specific level, that will guarantee that, that specific bacteria is going to die or something like that, just to make things a little more simple. So I think that's the same model that is being used for a specific chemotherapy, but for the specific targeted agents, that are not chemotherapies. So you are not really trying to distribute the drug in the body in a specific way. You are trying to reach a level in which you are blocking the pathway you want to block, right? So it's just a little bit different in terms of what these agents are trying to achieve, and that's why they come up with that drug that will guarantee that 90% or 95% of the BTK is blocked, and that dose does it in 95% of people, right? So that's why they're doing this fixed dosing instead of weight-based dosing. So it just looks at things that's just a bit different.
Thanks for clarifying. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that, or you guys are okay? All right, I'll turn it over. How about either of you? Anything else you want to add to that? Or no? Okay. All right. Lisa, you're up.
Thanks, Pete. The next section we're going to talk about is new drugs. Dr. Thomas, sorry, I can't see you there. And so we're going to ask 5 questions about new drugs, and I'm going to turn it back over to Pete, and we're going to talk about WM in general. And I just thought before we start those 5 questions, let's just do a speed round of the 6 of you, if that's okay. And the speed round is kind of, what is exciting for you that is on the horizon? What do you see that gives you hope that you're most like, keep your eye on this, folks, or why don't you go home and think a little bit more about that? Watch your, and in a sentence or like shorter, like just a bam, bam speed round. What do you think? Is that putting you on the spot, Dr. Kwok?
Yes, it does.
Or Dr. Desai? Thanks.
I'm excited about the trials that are coming up, especially the ones that we've been talking about in the WMNet. We'll be opening up our first one at the Fred Hutch with loncastuximab in conjunction with the Dana-Farber, which is really exciting, and all the other trials that are coming as well.
Oh, fabulous.
I think the new drugs are amazing, and I know that they're in good custodial hands with colleagues in other countries. In the UK, we're very excited about doing some deep diving into patient experience of living with WM, using wearable technologies and having a digital ecosystem. So we're about to embark on a study to look at that in a longitudinal way, so we can measure what it's like, because then we can add to the literature of which is not picked up in clinical trials so much, because this question about chemo versus long-term continuous therapy is a very thorny one. As we've discovered, it's hard to figure out what's best for people. So we are launching this study very soon to sort of get granular data, including patient-related outcomes, and hopefully that'll be in parallel with the drug development, and will help payers and commissioners to approve things with more data.
Fascinating. Dr. Thomas?
I think the pace of drug discovery is moving, so fast, and so much faster as the years go by. For example, I think one day we'll be talking more about CAR T-cell therapy, and I think it's so early in the development of that technology. I'm really excited to see where that heads in the years to come.
Yeah, so I think in addition to what I was just mentioned, I think I find it fascinating, how BTK has become such a big hotspot in terms of therapy. So, most of us are familiar with, the covalent BTK inhibitors, ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, zanubrutinib. Some of you are on those treatments, doing very well on that. But there's a new generation of BTK targeting agents. We have the non-covalent BTK inhibitors, right, making out into the market now. And there's now another type of medication called a BTK degrader. So you could, in theory, foresee a patient who is taking with Waldenstrom, who starts taking a covalent BTK inhibitor, and when that treatment stops working, then you can actually easily transfer into a non-covalent BTK inhibitor, continue the benefit, and then when that stops working, you can get into a BTK degrader and still get the benefit, right? So, and you haven't even moved out of one specific target within the malignant cell, and you're still, getting years of benefit with 3 different lines attacking the same hotspot. So, I think it's a very cool thing.
You just answered the next question, so thank you for BTK degraders.
I knew it.
You got it covered.
I knew it.
Dr. Matous, want to guess the next one? No, go for it.
No, just my thought is that in parallel, I think that number one, basic science drives everything. Mm-hmm. And so basic research is what leads to virtually every single advancement in our field. So that is where things are going. And since 2011, that is just the curve is exponentially going up for our understanding of the disease and therefore the treatments. In concert with that, I think for patients, developing fixed duration therapies with minimal toxicity and very high efficacy is what I'm excited about, finding a way to get there.
And seeing how we can fix, how we can manage with, say, a BTK inhibitor and a BCL2 inhibitor, but get fixed duration, but also tolerable, and not get into troubles with, recurrent low neutrophil counts, all that sort of thing. It's interesting because we're participating in the sonrotoclax studies, and I've always sort of been wondering, oh, is it just another Me2 BCL2 inhibitor? But then I read this publication in Blood yesterday suggesting, that it may avoid some of the mutations that are driven by venetoclax use. So that got me quite excited. Yeah. I've got to say, I only read it because I've got to do journal club in 48 hours when I get back home. So that was really encouraging. And so now I'm just interested in what you think in terms of sequencing. So if someone has progressed after, your BTK inhibitor, do you then, if you've got the option of a sonrotoclax study or a BTK degrader study, which one do I choose for them? Because I could be using both eventually, but and so it's really difficult. And I think it's a reminder of the importance of, for you as patients, really keeping your eye to the ground on what's available in clinical trials close to you, or feasibly close to you. And because there's so much coming. It's so exciting. I've had the experience with this direct BTK degrader, and in patients who really are struggling with their WM, and it's takes me back to the 10 years ago when you first had experience with ibrutinib with these patients. Seeing them respond is so exciting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was just a great way to start. So you all know, I hope you are taking notes, what to keep your eye on in the future. The next question is, following the recent phase 2 results of the CLOVER trial, is iopofosine, and thank you so much, Dr. Trotman, for saying it's such a difficult word to pronounce because you make me feel better. Iopofosine I-131 likely to be approved for WM. Does this drug cause bone marrow damage or an increased risk of acute myeloid leukemia or myelodysplastic syndrome? And if a couple of folks want to weigh in here, or
I was in the trial.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was hoping to start with you, Dr. Trotman, because of yesterday's presentation that you gave.
Yeah. Were you in the? No. Okay. So it's very early days. I believe it probably will be approved because it has very impressive overall response rates. So what we call a major response rate is when your IgM drops by more than 50%. And a major response rate was in 61% of patients. And we were 95% confident that that major response rate ranges between 45% and 76%. So that's a really good major response rate, and that's really encouraging. However, for me, and I hope for you, it's not just about your response rate. And it shouldn't even be about your IgM, it should be about how you feel. Right? And so that duration of response is only for about 8 months because the follow-up is so short. So, we can't predict how long that duration of response will last for. And there is no doubt that it requires an order of magnitude, an extra commitment from the patient because of the innocent bystander effect of this radio conjugate, its effect on the white cells, the healthy white cells, the healthy red cells, and the healthy platelets which clot the blood. So, 3/4 of patients have severely low platelet count, and many of them need a platelet transfusion for a couple of weeks. Many of them need red blood cell transfusions for a couple of weeks or 2 or 3 weeks at a time after each round of treatment. So it's quite a complex, not treatment. It is complex to give because you need your nuclear medicine practitioners to manage all that. But it's also complex in terms of the follow-up and the support that is given in the 3 months afterwards. So for me, it's got to have a really good duration of response along with recovery of normal healthy blood production for it to be something that will change my practice. So it's initial promise, but we need to see a lot more data. And whether it causes myelodysplastic syndrome or acute leukemia in the part, that's too early to say.
Thank you so much. If nobody has anything to add to that, then we'll go to the next question. Thank you so much for being able to address that. Now that initial results of the BROM trial have been reported, what are your impressions of this combination of bendamustine, rituximab, and acalabrutinib? Who wants to jump in there first and tell us what you think? Don't hold back.
I'm encouraged, and it warrants further exploration for sure. And so I think that's exactly the kind of thing I think we need, which is to combine agents that work in a different way, and then to build on that to see if, is our dosing, for example, of bendamustine, can that be altered when you're combining the drug to make it maybe safer or less toxic and so forth. So I think that we need to confirm these results, and they're going to be confirmed in WMNet in a related study. And so another plug for WMNet. And is that Andy's study? Yeah, Andy Brannigan's study from Massachusetts General. And so I think it's just another great thing. I mean, think about the clinical trials we had, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago in WM, and think of what's going on now. I mean, I remember, panabinostat being tested in WM, and no one will have any idea what that is.
No.
But, that was like a cool study, and now look at where we are now with the trials. It's very exciting.
Wow. Anybody want to add to that?
I mean, obviously, it's interesting to see the depth of the response that we're seeing with that type of study. I think it has many reasons why it's a cool study. I mean, it's a triplet, right? 3 agents. It's a finite duration therapy. You're using a BTK inhibitor. And because it's a finite duration therapy, more likely than not, you can use then a BTK inhibitor again if the disease were to relapse. So I think it has a lot of different components that makes me very excited about the study. Like any study, right, you need to see the efficacy, the duration of that efficacy, and potentially, the potential side effects too. So, I mean, we're encouraged about the initial process, but we need to look at the data more long term to understand what the true benefits are.
Thank you. Another one to keep our eye on. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, the only thing I was going to add was that there actually are some complete responses seen on that study. And, we don't often get to talk about complete responses in Waldenstrom, so although, certainly it's early days, but so far that's certainly encouraging. And the fact that they're talking about looking at minimal residual disease, like something that we haven't been able to talk about in Waldenstrom's as much because we haven't gotten to even complete response. I think it's going to be exciting to see what that shows.
It's exciting for us patients to hear those 2 words spoken on that stage, so thank you for adding that to the room. When do you expect tirabrutinib to be available in the USA? Dr. Matous is shaking his head before the question is even finished. He's like, don't hold your breath.
No idea.
Yeah. There's no way to know.
Folks are waiting.
The medication is already approved. I think this is the Chinese BTKI, right?
Yeah.
Is Japanese?
One of them is Japanese, the other one is for mono. Yeah, this is Japanese. So it's already approved in Japan. It's being used in Japan. I do not know if the company wants to do a U.S. approval. I'm not convinced that provides too much of a difference to what already exists in terms of.
I don't know what the different side effect profile. I'm not sure there's anything.
More like rashes, right?
Right.
But I mean, there was nothing in terms of efficacy that I felt it was a differentiator, right, between tirabrutinib and what is already in the market. But I really have no idea what Ono wants to do.
Fair enough.
It'd be very expensive to try and sort that out too to get an approval in a crowded area. Yeah.
Okay, last question in the new drug section. Given that specific gene mutations have been identified in WM, do you predict CRISPR technology will lead to a cure in WM? And a sigh from Dr. Matous and a thoughtful glance from Dr. Castillo.
Personally, I'm not sure because it's much more complicated than a gene or 2 genes. I mean, the Boston group has shown that even if you block BTK, that there are other pathways that are involved in the survival of a WM cell, and so I think it might be a little too much for a CRISPR technology, but I'm not an expert in that area.
I'm not an expert either, but I think where we may see CRISPR helping initially is in improving the CAR T-cell therapy. It seems like it may help with expanding the cells that are infused and helping with the preventing exhaustion of those cells so that the CAR T-cell therapy can work better.
Anything else to add?
Just one more thing. I mean, everybody's excited about CRISPR, and I think it's an amazing technology the way it works. But really, the long-term effect of CRISPR, we just don't know that. You know, and again, I mean, based on what is being published, it doesn't seem to be that would be a problem. But we need to see it, right?
Thank you so much, doctors, for talking about new drugs that are coming down the pipe. I'll turn it over to Pete. If Dr. Dessar or Dr. Kwok don't have anything to add, thank you so much.
Okay, the next set of questions are sort of a general in nature about WM. And earlier this morning, I listened to Dr. Matous' presentation on unusual complications. So, you know, the thing that was ruminating in my head when I heard that is each of us have the same disease, but we manifest it in different ways. So some have high IgM, some have low, some have extramedullary disease, some have other things. Is it possible to stage WM or classify different types of WM patients and then identify which treatment is appropriate for which type of patient? You probably do it already on an individual basis, but is there a way, can it be classified?
I mean, I can take that. So, I mean, when you think about classifications, it all depends on the system that you're using, right? So you can classify Waldenstroms in a clinical way, and you can have the anemia patients, and the neuropathy patients, and the hyperviscosity patients, and the big Neal syndrome patients, right? Extramedullary patients. But if you want to be very purist about it, then if you get into anemia, then you have the different types of anemia patients, right? So basically, at the end of the day, you end up with a classification, clinical classification that is extremely burdensome, right? You have like 50 different clinical syndromes. Now, if you want to look into the genomic aspect of things, right? So, okay, so you have the MYD88 patient, the CXCR4 patient, the TP53 patients, yes, no, frame shift, nonsense. So you can actually end up with a very busy classification from that side of things. And if you say, well, I'm not going to look into the genes, I'm going to look into the clinical aspects, I'm going to look into how the bone marrow looks like. Is it all B cells? Is it plasma cells? How much of each of them are? And, you know, so you could potentially lose yourself in classifying a disease. The question is, you know, which of these classifications actually help me treat the patient better or different? And unfortunately, I don't think there is a specific systematic way to say, you know, this specific thing that should be in this specific way. And that's, I think, it's going to be very difficult to come up, you know, with a system that, you know, will apply specifically for each and every situation. So at Dana-Farber, we have been, you know, pretty much following the MYD88 and CXCR4 pathways, specifically with ibrutinib. Things are changing a little bit now with zanubrutinib is more effective in CXCR4 patients, and ibrutinib rituximab is more effective in CXCR4 patients. So, you know, so things are maybe changing a little bit in that specific aspect of things. And then Zach Hunter now came up with this classification of the plasmacytic versus the B-cell classification, the subtypes. But we don't understand really well how that impacts, you know, the treatment of the patient himself. So I think it's an ongoing effort, but so far has been very difficult to formally classify a disease in one way that guarantees a good understanding, you know, from beginning to end of treating a patient with Waldenstrom's.
I think all of us have internal processors, and we meet a patient, and then all this information flows in, and we have a way of processing it. A frail guy, just a little bit of anemia, is that rituximab only, you know, or someone who has bulky disease, or somebody has neuropathy, or somebody has amyloid, and all these things, we just process them probably subconsciously to some level and come up with a treatment recommendation. I think that's how I do it.
What did you say, Dr. Trotman?
I said it's the AI in our brain after having seen it.
Okay, anyone else? Thank you. Yeah, I hadn't considered the rabbit hole aspect of trying to come up with something like that, but yeah, it's a good point.
It's a very deep rabbit hole.
Yes. Yeah, I think most of us kind of understand that from our own personal perspective. So the next question is, are there any peripheral blood lab measurements that correlate with LPL bone marrow involvement? Anyone can take
So
it.
what was the question again? Sorry.
Any peripheral blood measurements that can correlate with your bone marrow involvement?
We know it's not IgM.
And again, I mean, some cytopenias, right? Sometimes that can give us an idea if there's some cytopenias, maybe because of some, right? But again, it's not true for everybody, right? Because we have patients with 80, 90% involvement of the marrow, and their blood counts are still holding very solid. And then we have some patients who have like 50%, and they're anemic. So I don't think there's one reliable marker. Thoughts?
And I think what was really interesting, you know, to show how IgM is a relatively, I mean, it is crude, you know, when you've got a very, very high IgM, you tend to have a much more loaded bone marrow compared to the, you know, patient with a bit of neuropathy and a very low IgM, where you're searching to find the lymphoplasmacytic cell infiltrate. But what was fascinating in the early years with the ibrutinib and zanubrutinib studies, where the poor, well, they were very fortunate patients to be on the trials, but they had to have their bone marrows done every 3 months, and you'd do the bone marrow and you'd see their IgM coming down, and the bone marrow just never changed. It showed, you know, this extensive infiltrate of, so, you know, that sort of alludes to the fact that it switches off the activity, but the cells are still there.
Interesting. Thank you. The next question is, when should testing be done? Right now, you know, a lot of people do get tested for MYD88 and CXCR4. When should testing be done for other types of mutations?
So specifically for other mutations, it's a little bit difficult because we don't necessarily have different treatments to offer based on the various gene mutations that we may find. So perhaps a reason to look for new gene mutations could be if you feel like clinically the behavior of the disease is changing. Maybe there are new low blood counts that are not easily explained by, that don't match labs, and you're trying to understand if there's another process going on that is contributing to those low blood counts, like where there's something about the behavior of the disease that is changing. Maybe it's becoming more aggressive. That's perhaps a scenario where you'd want to repeat the gene mutation testing.
And this is a fine point, but it's not always a gene mutation that can cause trouble. You can have other genetic or DNA events that can cause trouble that aren't classically a mutation. And one of those is called TP53. Sometimes that's a very important part of one chromosome, and sometimes it's just gone, you know. And so, but I think when I have a patient whose clinical behavior is changing, like Sheeba said, sometimes I worry that they may have picked up this problem with this TP53 gene, and we have some data that can help us make treatment decisions sometimes. It always makes us worry a bit more when we find it. Yeah.
Thank you. Either of you want to chime in? No? Okay. So it's kind of related to that is, how should a patient be concerned about a 6q deletion?
I'm going to be a bit heretic here. I mean, you should be more concerned about the tempo of your disease, because I think the tempo of your symptoms, the tempo of your IgM, your hemoglobin, tells me a lot more about the biology of the disease than discovering a 6q. And yes, you know, you get a whole group of patients together and you analyze, and I think it's about, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to take a punt here, it's about 30% of people will have a 6q mutation. And yes, you put them all together and they have a higher prognostic, you know, a worse prognostic score and outcomes long term. But I think it's more important clinically then what your mutation analysis is with respect to 6q.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be careful about this. Any of these prognostic factors that are being thrown, because, for example, the deletion 6q is one study, right? I think if I'm not mistaken, it's the Spanish group, right? So the Spanish group published this paper about the poor prognosis in deletion 6q. It's one study from that center, and that's it. So there's no validation. There has not been tried in larger populations. So in medicine, we need to be very careful because nothing is black or white. There are shades of gray, more than 50 shades of gray throughout pretty much everything you can imagine, right? So, I agree. I think the sole fact that somebody has a deletion 6q, I don't think that changes my practice in a dramatic way. But I do pay attention more to how the patient is actually feeling or doing.
Yeah, so I agree. I think the very nature of science is to be what's called reductionist, so that we can try and assess the contribution of different variables to the situation. But I think it simplifies things which, to the extent that they can't really make sense in isolation. At the end of the day, the human body is super complex. The tools we have to study it are very rudimentary, actually, especially in regards to the immune system and the crosstalk between the genome and the immune system. So I think these are all step-by-step contributions to the bigger picture, and we just need to keep working on that and not kind of knee-jerk in any direction on any one of these points.
Thank you. The next question is, probably all of you might want to try and address this, but out of curiosity, we've heard the statistic that WM occurs in 3 in a million. In your opinion, and that's been based on studies from years ago, so in your opinion, is the prevalence of WM increasing today? Or you think there's more people than that are...
Well, it has to. Because you're all living longer, all right? So you're more prevalent, right?
I mean, in terms of people getting diagnosed.
The difference is the incidence. And I'm not aware of any data that the incidence is increasing.
Changing, no.
No, the incidence.
I agree. So, incidence is how many new cases you have in a year, and that has not changed in the last 20 years. Prevalence, on the other hand, is a product of the incidence and the life expectancy of the patient.
Thank you.
So if the patient is living longer, then the prevalence is higher. So let's say 10 years ago, there were 30,000 patients with Waldenstroms or 20,000 patients with Waldenstroms in the country. Right now, there are probably 40,000 patients with Waldenstroms in the country, right? And that's the prevalence, which is different than the incidence.
You're always going to have more and more people attending the Ed Forum. Right? It's going to be your biggest yet.
And
like
more and more people helping to accelerate the cure.
Yeah.
Right?
There we go.
Thank you. And I appreciate the language lesson from Jorge. And I used the wrong term. You're right. So the next question is the last one in this series. Can WM cause non-infectious respiratory problems, for example, shortness of breath or chronic cough? If so, is there a differential diagnosis associated with that?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I should have included that in my unusual complications of WM lecture, and I'm sure we've all seen it. So I think there are patients who get lymph node enlargement in the chest that can sometimes trigger cough. They can be unrelenting, and I've seen patients accumulate fluid in their chest from WM. Either WM, sometimes they can line the surface of the lung and irritate that part of the lung and cause fluid. And sometimes that fluid can get, sometimes also something called a duct that goes through and transmits lymph back to the venous system called the thoracic duct. Sometimes I've seen that get obstructed by WM and cause a milky pleural effusion sometimes. And so you can see things. And Sheeba,
I was going to add, if the blood gets too thick, that can sometimes also manifest as shortness of breath. Rarely you can have Waldenstrom's with amyloid that will also present in the lungs and can cause shortness of breath just by taking up space.
And the cough's a really interesting thing because I've had a few patients who say their cough went away. They hadn't sort of listed the cough as one of their symptoms, and then they realize, oh my God, that coughing that was keeping me going all night, it's just disappeared. And yet you go back and you look at their scans, and I can't find the notes.
No, I've had that as well.
Yeah, it's really weird. But that's something that gets, hopefully, will be captured in Whimsical with larger cohorts, just like we captured cramps. Because it's something that we all go, oh, we all have cramps. But disabling recurrent cramps seems to be, something that patients have with symptomatic Waldenstroms. About 10%, I think it was.
I think it's also worth remembering that acid reflux can cause cough.
Oh.
And that can be, you can start investigating the lungs and things in a very big way, but it's sometimes down to that, and you can take something that blocks the acid. I mean, not unsupervised, it should be monitored, but that can really make a difference, I think.
Thank you. Lisa?
Thanks, Pete. So the next section we're going to be talking about is treatment, and we want to kind of understand how do you think about treating and treatment so that we can be the best partners in the room with you. So the first question is of 3. Given that most patients will relapse after treatment, what is the best way to sequence therapies? Dr. Thomas, you laughed, so you know you have to go first. Sorry, Dr. Castillo, if you're ready to, whoever wants to jump in.
I don't think we know. I think it's a matter of practice. I think, chemoimmunotherapy and BTK inhibitors are, excellent treatment options for patients. And I think you can use one and then the other on relapse, or you can use one and the other on relapse. I think in my practice, I would say probably 2/3 of the patients prefer to use BTK inhibitors first and chemoimmunotherapy later. About 1/3 of patients in my practice use chemotherapy first and then BTK inhibitors later. That distribution might be a little bit different.
Yeah, let's do all 6 to hear what that's like. I think that would be fascinating.
I think it's always a discussion, and again, it comes down to the same things we talked about earlier: what other medical problems somebody has, what other medications they're on, whether they have a preference for the taking a pill once a day versus just coming for their X number of months and being done. All of those things get weighed in. The fortunate thing is that no matter whether we choose a BTK inhibitor or whether we choose a fixed duration therapy, we have a very good chance of getting the response that we want.
Thank you. Dr. Matous, Dr. Trotman?
I think it's, I probably am a little more chemoimmunotherapy than Jorge's practice. It also depends on where one practices, in which country, in terms of what your options are. But I think the key is to educate your patients and about their options. The patients very often will make the decision after you educate them. And always, always, always see if you have a clinical trial available.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Like you, I'm the rituximab chemotherapy first for the vast majority, and I'm pleased that I'm restricted to that because I can only get zanubrutinib for the patients who are frail and unfit for chemotherapy. And to me, that's, as I said yesterday, the patient who has, less than 7 years life expectancy otherwise, I think it's a great way to just start with a BTK inhibitor for that, because I expect that will see them through their life. But for people who are otherwise, fit enough, it's very hard to find a patient who's not fit enough for dexamethasone, cyclophosphamide and rituximab. And just because you start, as I say to every patient, whether I'm starting with 6 cycles of BR or 6 cycles of DCR, we're starting at full dose first cycle, but we probably will have to dose adjust to suit you and your response and your tolerance of the treatment. So it doesn't mean to say that we will necessarily have to give you all 6 cycles at full dose.
Thank you. Dr. Desai?
A lot has been captured already. I think, in a way, we doctors are in a position of considerable power in how we tell our message about treatments. So we need to be very mindful of that. I mean, in the UK, we can't use BTK inhibitors up front, and I was not by any means devastated by that because we have really good chemoimmunotherapy treatments which have stood the test of time. So I think it's an ongoing discussion, dialogue. We're learning, and we need to capture the data as we go along. And I think every patient is literally different. So even if you develop some amazing algorithm for sequencing for patient A, it won't work in patient B necessarily. That's the nature of medicine and biology.
We also have discussions about the different options and ultimately leave it up to the patient when it comes to hearing about side effects and how many times they have to drive to downtown Seattle and all this kind of stuff. I will say, though, that one thing that I've learned as I've treated more patients with Waldenstrom's is sometimes the numbers don't come down super fast. And one thing that we have to talk about with patients is to make sure that, we're kind of giving it a good try over a period of months before saying, maybe it's not working. And that sometimes the responses can come, but they could come a little bit slower than we might want them to occur. And so that's another thing to just kind of keep in mind, that sometimes it takes time.
Thank you. One of the hardest things sometimes is to be a patient. When is it appropriate to prescribe Rituxan maintenance following BNR? Many in this room have had it, have not had it, and so interesting to hear your thoughts. Jump in. You can pass.
Dr. Rummel did a large study with this, and where he looked at bendamustine rituximab and concluded for the overall population that the addition of maintenance therapy really didn't impact the overall outcome for the patients. But then he sort of drilled down and said, well, it would be nice if you published this, by the way, too.
Yes.
So he drilled down, and I think he found that for the older patients, there was a trend to maybe a better length of the remission before they needed to be retreated. But I've largely abandoned maintenance therapy after BR. I don't know if anybody else is using it.
Yeah, I don't use maintenance therapy
much
after
bulk
BR,
around
but I
these?
do, because we're entitled to 8 doses of rituximab, particularly the patients who have, started with an IgM of 8,000 and have, really heavy tumour burden. And you see, thank you so much, Mary, for your comments about the slow responder, because you do have some patients who are taking a long time. And sometimes I've seen patients whose, IgM continues to drop for years after they've finished their first-line treatment. Slow but steady tortoise. And they're the ones in whom I like to give those extra 2 doses of the rituximab at the end to just push it out a bit longer.
The chef's kiss.
Oh, I was just saying, one of the things that came out from Dr. Rummel's study was that the patients who were they couldn't show a benefit in how long people lived overall and the length of time the disease stayed controlled, but they also saw an increased incidence of infections in the patients who got prolonged rituximab versus not.
So just one small caveat in that study, you have to be at least in a partial response or better to qualify for that study. So patients in minor response were not part of that study. So just out there in the air. I'm using much less maintenance rituximab than what we did previously because of that study. But there are some specific patients in whom I'm worried, not precisely about the IgM levels or the blood counts, by other things, let's say kidney damage. And I really want to protect that kidney. Sometimes I do maintenance in those type of patients, but it is a very, very small group of people.
Thank you. I want to ask you about another study now, and this will be a quick question. Then maybe we can do a very quick round robin for my last question, see if there's time, Pete, for any more. We're squeezing in here. Is it true that if you have made it without treatment for 5 years, your chance of needing treatment after that is at about 5 to 10%, about 6% per year? Now, those of you that know Carl Harrington will know that this is his favorite study to quote. And it was done by Dr. Kyle showing this, and I would like to just have you speak to that to confirm that Carl Harrington is spreading the right news to the world.
So was that study smoldering Waldenstrom, or there was?
Smoldering.
Smoldering.
Yes.
So I think it was the rate of progression from smoldering to symptomatic was 12% per year for the first 5 years, and then the curve sort of starts to plateau. So it goes down to about 2% per year for the next 5 years. And I think, beyond that, I think it's reported out to about the first 10 years.
I'm not an actuary, but I tell my patients always, the longer you go, the longer you go.
Yeah, and absolutely. So it's as simple as that, And then the other thing is too, is then the consultation is about, your weight's gone up, your blood pressure's high, you haven't had your fecal occult blood testing, what's with your PSA, I promised you were going to live to be an old man, and you're not doing your part, so you start giving them a bit of a hard time over, the other factors that are going to affect their life expectancy. Because this odds ratio of 1.7, a 1.7-fold of getting other cancers is a significant, really significant. So they've really got to be particularly, the longer you go, patients got to be thinking about the other cancers, and skin cancers in Australia is a huge problem. So I always get them to whip out as many skin cancers as possible before they start their BTK inhibitors and that sort of thing.
Yep. So from the smoldering data, patients who are diagnosed with Waldenstrom's untreated, we did a recent study. It was Dana-Farber, Mayo, and some other groups. We put about 440 patients untreated, and we followed them over time. And they were followed over time. So it was a 30% chances of getting treated within 2 years. So that's 15% per year, right? Just a little. But then it kind of plateaus after that to about 6% per year, and it gets to about 80% at 10 years. Those are the numbers that I tend to cite. They're very similar to what you just described. Yeah. Very similar study.
Thank you.
Similar results.
That's very clarifying. Is there anything to add here? Okay, I love to ask the one speed round, if that's okay, Pete. We'll do like a super quick.
Yeah.
We've got lots of people watching around the world, and many who will watch this recording. And you have all rocked it, by the way. Can I just say, Rockstar Docs have earned their name. What is the one thing you wish every Waldenstrom patient knew? What is the one thing that you wish they could hold as a truth? Take a beat. Dr. Desau, would you like to start us off?
I think information is power. It's a complex area, and there are many kind of variables at play. So being well informed and fighting your corner in increasingly beleaguered health systems as well, I think is the key thing.
Thank you.
You asked me this on the first day, and it's still a hard question.
Sorry,
today.
Dr. Kwok, I'm doing it to you again.
But I really loved the video that they showed of Dr. Treon earlier, showing that understanding the biology is really changing the way that we approach and treat this disease. And I think that's really exciting, and it makes us think that the future for treating Waldenstrom's is really bright. And so I guess I would encourage patients to hold on to that, and then also to participate in clinical trials if they're open to that.
Thank you.
I think we are all partners on the same team working towards the common goal, and I think if you as patients, we as doctors, if we look at this as us working together to a common goal, you telling us about what's happening with you, asking questions, trying to follow your lab, what the labs along, that's how we can work together to help you live the best quality of life that you can.
Great answer.
So, from what I'm hearing, right, is, research, education, right, clear communication lines with your physician. I think a very key part is that you should not be alone in your journey. right? I mean, I think the more people around you that know about this, that you can share with, that can learn with you, they can understand things with you and go along in this journey with you, I think that will be also key in all these features, all these aspects of the care that we're talking about will allow you for the patient to be their own best advocates. At the end of the day, that's the way it should be. I welcome patients that come to talk to me to have a very high level, deep discussion in terms of the conditions that they have. I don't feel intimidated when patients come with their own papers and their own abstracts, and I'm happy. I mean, that means to me that this is an educated patient. Then I can have a very different discussion level with that patient compared to a patient that tells me, you tell me what I should do, right? Which is a different type of patient, and that's okay. So we need to understand as physicians that there are different types of patients. But I think I particularly work very well with patients who are very well educated, the patients who understand what we're trying to do, who are very open to discuss things with me, and who have a group of people behind them supporting them too.
Thank you.
I still encounter patients who didn't find IWMF. They find the clinic in a different way. And I think what more can be done, because even a cursory visit to the search engine on the internet should bring you to the International Women's Foundation. What's
That's it.
The Women's Media Foundation.
the Media Foundation. No.
I know it's really.
But we still find patients who don't know about IWMF, and IWMF is the model. It's the model for information for patients and caregivers and physicians, right? For everybody about a relatively rare disease. So I think still, I know everyone probably does the same thing. If you get a call from a doc, you send your patient to IWMF.com. I put it in my notes, make sure your patient's gone here. And it's, I think, just somehow still getting IWMF out there, because we're just scratching the surface with everybody who's here relative to the total number of WM patients worldwide. That's a challenge for the organization.
And as a doctor who treats a lot more than WM, I see the IWMF as a great exemplar for other lymphoma communities. Way ahead of so many other lymphoma communities. I think the message I try to give to every patient is that because we know, I'm confident you are going to be living longer, but because there are so many new treatments, I really don't know what I will be treating you with in 10, 15 years' time. And that these treatments are not just helping you live longer, they're actually helping you live better. And that's so important. But there is, and I might get into trouble for saying this is not a message I give to everyone, but I do have to say to some people, don't let your Waldenstroms define you. And you have to, you have to park it a bit sometimes. Yeah.
Instead of getting into trouble, I think you've just ended us on the perfect note as we are about to go out into the world and leave this planet Waldenstrom behind and get on our planes and trains and automobiles to take us back to life where we will continue to live most joyfully and meaningfully, even with this disease. So, Pete, I turn it to you.
Thank you. Yes. I just want to thank each of you for being willing to spend the weekend with us and also to answer some probing questions and in a collegial manner especially. And it seemed like even if there's a difference of opinions, that you respect each other's opinion, and we really respect your opinions also and your willingness to do this, and can't thank you enough. Really, thank you seems like such a small word.